In the 5th century before Christ, the people of Athens built a grand temple, the Parthenon. Perched atop a hill with a commanding view of the harbor, the temple was dedicated to Athena, the god of war from which the city itself had taken its name. To most Greeks outside of Athens, however, the Parthenon was a humiliating reminder of the brief subjugation they had experienced under the short-lived Athenian Empire. With the decline of Athens, the Parthenon was adapted to the needs of a host of new rulers. 1,000 years after its completion, for instance, the Byzantine emperors converted it into a Christian church for the Virgin Mary. Another 1,000 years after that, Athens came under the dominion of the Ottoman Empire, which converted it into a mosque and military storehouse. Then, in 1687, the Venetians laid siege to the city. A direct hit on a gunpowder magazine stored within the Parthenon blew off the roof, gutted the courtyard, and killed 300 people. All told, over a period of more than 2,000 years, the Parthenon had served as a pagan temple, a Christian church, an Islamic mosque, and a military fortress. But now, it was a ruin. In the year 1798, as the shattered marble and melancholy rubble of Athens began to attract the attention of European travelers on the Grand Tour, the heated rivalry between England and France spilled over into the Mediterranean. Napoleon, hoping to cut off British access to India through the Red Sea, invaded Egypt and occupied the city of Cairo. This provocative act elicited an immediate response from Constantinople, whose Ottoman rulers had long governed Egypt as a province within their own empire. It did not take long for both sides to realize that the enemy of their enemy was their friend. The British promptly dispatched a fleet to the Egyptian coast and engaged French forces on both land and sea. To the Sultan in Constantinople, London disavowed any ulterior motives in Egypt and claimed that it was merely assisting in the restoration of the status quo. Selected to deliver this message to the Sultan was Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin. Elgin was to serve as Britain's first permanent ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. The Earl, having inherited a prestigious title and married into a wealthy family, was then blazing one of the most promising careers in all of British politics. He was already a lieutenant colonel in the military and had served as diplomatic envoy to Vienna, Brussels, and Prussia. Urged by his doctors to seek warmer climes for the benefit of his health, Elgin heard about the proposed embassy to Constantinople and decided to submit his name for consideration. At the same time, the architect in charge of building his new estate suggested to Elgin that such a post would place him in tantalizing proximity to Athens, from which an increasing number of British travelers were returning with stunning illustrations of ancient Greek architecture and sculpture. Would it not be a service to the arts of Britain, he asked, if Elgin could help his countrymen move beyond such two-dimensional models and bring back three-dimensional plaster casts of those sculptures still remaining on the Parthenon? Elgin loved the idea. From this point forward, he became possessed with the notion that he alone was capable of, quote, stimulating the progress of the fine arts in Great Britain, bestowing some benefit on the progress of taste in England, and improving circumstances towards the advancement of literature and the arts. Fortunately for Elgin, his role as ambassador afforded him precisely the sort of leverage he would need to pull off such a feat. As so many ambassadors and consuls to follow in Elgin's footsteps would soon discover for themselves, powerful diplomats in a foreign land were in a unique position to ask for special favors from their hosts. And this is precisely what Elgin, soon to be the most welcome man in Constantinople, proceeded to do. In November 1799, Elgin arrived in the Ottoman capital. Not long after, a team of painters, draughtsmen, plaster experts, and architects hired by Elgin began to assemble across the sea at Athens. Their chief task was to make three-dimensional plaster casts of the original Greek sculptures still adorning the skeletal remains of the Parthenon. The idea that they might actually detach the very sculptures themselves and take them back to England had not yet crossed any of their minds. In order to complete their work, Elgin's men asked the Earl to procure a firman on their behalf. A firman was a document signed by an Ottoman official that granted permission for the bearer to travel, reside, and work in certain capacities. Without it, the governor of Athens had proven himself unwilling to allow Elgin's men entry into the Acropolis, the rocky hill on which the Parthenon stood. As the governor correctly pointed out, the Acropolis was a restricted military fortress, still stocked with the same sort of artillery and ammunition that the Venetians had blown to Kingdom Come just 1 century earlier. In addition, he claimed, it was not just the endless expanse of the Aegean Sea that visitors to the Acropolis could enjoy. They also had intolerable views of Turkish women changing their clothes in the residences below. Back in Constantinople, Elgin applied for the firman. His timing could not have been better. At that very moment, the summer of 1801, 17,000 British soldiers had just dropped anchor on the Egyptian coast and began to inflict severe losses on French forces. Unless the French somehow managed to turn the tide of battle, there was little doubt that Elgin would get whatever he asked for, especially if all he asked for were the pagan adornments to a derelict building. Unfortunately for Elgin's men, however, the delivery of this first firman to the governor of Athens coincided with the approach of yet another French fleet in the Aegean Sea, raising fears of an attack on the Acropolis. As a result, Elgin's men were again denied access to the site. Frustrated, Elgin applied for a second firman, one with enough force to override any objections the local governor might see fit to raise. Remarkably, the second application coincided with a second battlefield success. Just 3 weeks earlier, the French army had formally surrendered Cairo to the British. With Elgin now the most honored diplomat in all of Constantinople, the Sultan ordered a senior Ottoman official named Rashid Aga to cross the Aegean Sea himself and personally deliver the second firman to the local governor. This firman granted permission for Elgin's men to make their drawings and plaster casts, as well as remove any loose sculpture found on or just beneath the soil. If the message on paper was not clear enough, Rashid Aga also saw fit to inform the governor that he would be sent as a slave to the galleys if the terms of this firman were not observed. Now terrified of his fate, the governor of Athens proved most eager to lend a helping hand. So eager, in fact, that one of Elgin's men, the Reverend Philip Hunt, was inspired to make a bold proposal. Perhaps, he wondered, the governor might now consent not just to the making of plaster casts, but also to the physical removal of the original sculptures. Duly chastened by the Sultan, the governor of Athens granted the request. What happened next was a secret to no one. Rashid Aga, the Sultan's personal envoy, was present in Athens while the marbles were removed. Once removed, all 120 tons of them were packed into 50 bulky crates and transported through multiple ports of call throughout Ottoman domains. Though Elgin had certainly exceeded the original terms of his firman, he had done so with the full knowledge and cooperation of everyone from the Sultan in his palace on down to the customs clerk in his office. Lord Elgin, who had been absent from Athens throughout the ordeal and entirely unaware of Reverend Hunt's bold initiative until after its completion, was nonetheless elated with the news. Regarding the relocation of the marbles to London as, quote, a very essential service to the arts in England, the Earl could also not help to note that, quote, Bonaparte has not got such a thing from all his thefts in Italy. The Reverend Hunt drove this point home further, claiming that, quote, these admirable specimens of Greek sculpture had been repeatedly refused to the gold and influence of France in the zenith of her power. In reflecting on the actions of his men in Athens, the Earl bristled at any suggestion that they had acted dishonorably. Napoleon was a thief. He was a hero. Not only that, he claimed, but the repeated neglect and deliberate destruction enacted on the Parthenon by the Turks and Greeks had thoroughly deprived them of any claim to act as morally enlightened stewards of the ruins. The Turks, he later said, have been continually defacing the heads. In some instances, they have actually acknowledged to me that they have pounded down the statues to convert them into mortar. 15 years later, Elgin sold his marbles to the British Museum, where they still remain today. Will the marbles ever be returned to Greece? The question itself should probably be reframed, for in the 2200 years between the construction of the Parthenon and the arrival of Elgin's men, the Greek nation, as it is now commonly imagined to have existed, was nowhere to be found. In fact, if we could go back in time, we would discover that the ancestors of most modern Greeks, if they ever saw or even heard of the Parthenon at all, likely regarded it as an unwelcome reminder of the domination they had experienced by the rulers of one city and one city alone, Athens. From this perspective, in the summer of 1801, the Parthenon simply came to serve a new master in a new role, much as it had for the Christians and Muslims before. Now, it was to serve as an intangible bargaining chip in a larger diplomatic negotiation between the British and Ottoman empires. In exchange for the complementary defeat of a powerful French antagonist and return of their Egyptian province pro bono, the Ottoman Sultan was ready to grant the British ambassador his pick of any favor he desired. And one of the favors Elgin chose to redeem was the procurement of 100 tons of pagan marble from a derelict building in a provincial backwater. From a historical perspective, then, the real issue is not whether or not the Elgin marbles belong in Greece. They currently belong, and have always belonged, to whosoever the most powerful man in the eastern Mediterranean is at any given time, to do with as he pleases. More useful to the present situation is to recognize that the true value of the Elgin marbles cannot be reckoned in legal, moral, or even financial terms. Their true value was political. As a result, until the day comes when the modern Greek state finds itself enjoying the same power imbalance with regard to Britain that Britain once enjoyed with regard to the Ottoman Empire, the people of Athens will search in vain for the sort of strategic leverage capable of turning priceless works of art into diplomatic barter commodities. The Elgin marbles mark the first time that a collection of antiquities served as a voluntary bargaining chip between two diplomatic parties with vastly different conceptions about the aesthetic and symbolic value of the material cultures within their grasp. It would not be the last time, though, for soon after Elgin's return to England, the treasures of ancient Egypt began to play a similar role. To understand the Egyptian counterparts to Lord Elgin and his marbles, please join us next time as we explore the life and times of the Great Belzoni in Episode 5 of Indiana Jones in History.